All right. So the uh, gist of this classroom, or the idea for this classroom is I just want to kind of do more of a design analysis, particularly with in relation or in correlation to this week's assignments, which is primarily sci-fi design. So we're doing spaceships this cycle. That doesn't mean that, because particularly the things that we're going to be looking at aren't spaceships, ironically, but that doesn't really matter. It's primarily I want to show you an analysis of sci-fi design and what they kind of use to make things look more entertaining, and look a little bit more futuristic. And so we're going to be analyzing some objects, and see how that has a direct correlation to the assignments that I make you do in part one, which is the beveling and rounding of edges, because that's primarily why I'm teaching you these things, or why I'm letting you do these things, is because that's actually what it directly applies into sci-fi design. And it might be hard to see in the beginning when you're rounding off boxes and cylinders to see the correlation with sci-fi design, but it's the exact same principle of anything that I teach. It's like the fundamentals drive whatever cool design you want to do, and if you master those, you can do whatever you want. Now, when I analyze sci-fi design, the main things that I see in a lot of them, and we're gonna look at a lot of Overwatch examples, primarily because they are the best example for where graphic design meets functional design. It's not all functional. We're gonna look at an example from my buddy Jonas Minebo, who has a tutorial on the website as well, that is a lot more functional, but sometimes it's harder to see those design principles. So usually what we see with sci-fi is that we have chamfering, beveling, and filleting of edges, like what I make you guys do. It's just another word for it: rounding, multiple rounding, beveling, whatever it's called. So you see a lot of that. The main reason you see a lot of that is because it looks more manufactured and it looks more engineered, right? The reason they usually do chamfering and beveling is because it creates less stress points. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there's a thing called stress points, and I'm absolutely not an engineer, but that's what I've heard of and read about. And if you want a really interesting talk about it, you should definitely check out Mike Hill's talk on this. And when it comes to stress points, like if you everywhere you have hard edges, you can create stress, right? So anything that has abrupt changes in its topology or geometry will create stress points. That's one of the reasons that airplanes have round windows, or rounded windows, right? Because if they would have square windows, the airplanes just ripped apart, as they used to do in the early 30s or 40s, I think. The airplanes would just rip in half just because they had square windows, right? So you can see stress points are very, very crucial. And so that's usually why they chamfer or bevel a lot of things. And then additionally, we have addition and subtraction. That means that we're adding or subtracting shapes to make them look more interesting. We have the rules of graphic design, usually big, medium, small, 1/3, rule of thirds, rule of fifths, these kind of things. And then stating the obvious. It's the one that's less talked about, but if you look at real life design, and we're gonna look at this when we go through the examples. When you look at real life design, in our everyday life, usually the functional things are pretty well hidden, right? Because they want to the product designers want to keep the product aesthetically pleasing, and so usually they hide a lot of the functionality of things. Whereas in entertainment design, we usually tend to emphasize the functional things, right? Like the joints or whatever needs to come out or whatever, because we need to highlight those things either for gameplay reasons or just to sell the believability to the audience, right? So a lot of times in mech design, you'll see the highest form of detailing will be around the joints, right? Or in any prop design, which is usually the opposite in real life examples, just because it's not appealing, at least for buyers, right? So at any time, the goal when you're a designer, whether you want to make things as functional as they can be, at the end of the day, things need to be entertaining, right? We're in the entertainment industry, and so that's why we have a little bit of a bias towards the graphic design of things versus functional. It completely also depends on the industry and the game that you're working for, but again, at all times, things need to look entertaining. So that's what you should definitely keep in the back of your mind when we're going through these examples. So when it comes to something very simplistic, you know, I'm making you guys do the cylindrical exercises, you know, cylinders, rounding off those cylinders, beveling those cylinders. You can definitely see the real life application of that in these examples, right? So where we have these canisters, it's like a beautiful design of just where the cylinders are either being rounded, like with a multiple rounding, or where they use something like a, let me search for it, a little bit more of a, you know, a bevel, where it's just a straight chamfering towards a thinner cylinder, right? And so when you're doing this, especially when you're doing this in the beginning, it will be very hard to make these things look pleasing. And that's just because of the graphic design rules that I talked about in the previous slide, where a lot of us, and even I struggle with this, is in order to find that pleasing balance of areas of rest versus areas of detail and where to put your detail is very crucial in making things look either interesting or very clumsy and noisy, right? So that's a big difference. And as you can see, like the designs in Overwatch are fantastic examples of really, really good design, even on simple objects. Now, if you look at what I said earlier about stating the obvious, right? As you can see here, I'm not sure what these are. I don't play enough Overwatch for them, but I guess there's some kind of canisters that provide anything like from gas. But as you can see, what they're doing in the functionality of things is they're stating the obvious, right? Like this is some type of functional canister, and they're overemphasizing with blockier forms that this is what its prime function is, right? So that's the stating the obvious principle. And then in terms of the shape relations of things, it's very, very entertaining. So as you can see, for instance, the larger portion of this canister is like a 1/3 of the smaller one, right? So it's a nice division of shapes. Same here. Right, 1/3. And then overall, the areas of detail are in like a 1/3 or a 1/5 division as well. So you see they're super careful about where they place their detailing. And even within the 2/3, let me just go back to, right? So we have this area that is divided in like a 2/3 principle. Even within that, like this red band that they have across, like a graphic design, it's nicely placed on a 1/3 of that division, right? So there's that's not by accident, you know, that's very meticulously planned out, or just by intuitiveness by the designer themselves. So it's very carefully thought out. Same thing here, where they, interlace these locks. Again, There are probably 4 going on, by the way. There's another one on the other side. We're not seeing that. Again, that comes to informative design, and also it's more pleasing that you only see 3. Again, rule of 3, right? This lock that kind of holds down the canister, or makes you able to attach it to something. Again, it's like 1/3 of the size of the width of the canister, right? So everything usually follows like that 1/3 or 1/5 principle. If we move on to something like this, again, very entertaining design, very simplistic, right? In essence, this is just a box. But what makes it look interesting and what makes it look more sci-fi is the way that they divide up the shapes, the way they chamfer the shapes, right? And the way they use it proportionally in any direction, by the way, horizontally, vertically. The way they break that up makes it look entertaining, even how simple it is. And that's why, like what I said in the Proco video as well, if you're still unable to make simple geometry look interesting, then don't bother making super complicated mech designs, right? Things like this will make you a better designer, and it's very hard to do, trust me. So again, chamfering here, where we go from a normal box, right? We could consider this being a normal box, right? So there's a nice chamfering of the edges. Here, right? I'm just going to roughly go over these. If you don't know anything about chamfering or beveling or whatever, please look at the edge manipulation video. I talk about it there. And then we have like a multiple rounding, so to speak, but it's in a bevel kind of way, where we protrude a smaller piece, which is like a 2/3 width of the entire box, where they chamfer that out, right? Or bevel, sorry. It's very hard for me to keep a distinction between chamfering and beveling, so I'm sorry if I mix those up, but it's kind of the same principle. So you see straight edges, they bevel that out. They make that shape already a little bit more interesting with secondary shapes, right? Just by actually manipulating the edges. That's what makes it look more interesting. Now, if we continue this down, we can look at this in 2 ways. We either, I'm gonna get rid of these for a second. We either can look at this as being a simple box like this, and then we have an additional shape, so an extra, right, kind of box being added to this, right? Or you can regard it as a bigger box where this negative shape has been cut out of, right? So that depends on how you want to look at it. I like to look at it as a subtractive method because I like cutting into my simple shapes more than adding to them. Just from a functional point of view, it's not really, doesn't have any merit if you either do one or the other. But as you can see, again, what they're doing when they're adding this extra shape, right? Or when they're cutting it out, this piece sits in 1/3 of the entire mass, right? This is 2/3. So again, from going from primary shapes to secondary shapes, we have that nice division of adding a shape or cutting out a shape, whatever way you want to look at it, and doing it in the 1/3 or the rule of third principle. You could have easily cut out a shape in like the 1/3 division, and it still would have looked good, but it just would have looked different, right? But again, as you can see, they usually use that principle of thirds. And that's, I think, is very important to keep in mind when you guys go and try to make your own shapes whether it's for a spaceship or anything you want to make or want to appear look sci-fi, is that keeping that rule of thirds is very important. Just also like in the viewing angle, the mass of whatever holding, I don't even know what this is, right? This is like an apothecary sort of pull-out cabin, right? But so with this thing that's holding it together and this thing where it's coming out of, like they make up 1/3 of the entire design, right? Again, so this cabin, let me use another color, is like 2/3, right? So both horizontally, vertically, these designers really pay attention to that. And I'm not saying that they always use that rule, but it's a very easy rule to use because we use it in composition as well, right? It's something that makes things look more pleasing and a little bit better manufactured, right? Instead of using these random numbers and kind of eyeballing everything, because usually when we tend to eyeball things, we go too symmetrical, right? We do like a 50-50 split, or we make it too noisy. And that's why we, as a beginner, you usually end up with very clunky looking shapes because you're not trying to apply those principles meticulously. Then another thing that I got from a Joe Peterson tutorial a long time ago, and I advise you check out his Gumroad tutorial. It's really amazing on tech design. Is something that once he told me, like I instantly saw it in every type of sci-fi design, and that is detailing, right? So this is a little bit more advanced. It's like tertiary shapes or even like just detailing shapes. It doesn't have anything to do with breaking up the shape, but it is very appealing to look at. So when it comes to detailing, again, what I see a lot of beginners do is they'll start detailing just randomly, right? They'll just add shapes wherever, right? And then kind of be surprised why it doesn't look aesthetically pleasing. And usually when you analyze sci-fi design, almost all detailing is kept to a minimum at the edges of the shapes. So as you can see here, we have this paneling cut out, right? And we do, the detailing is like at the edges. Usually because we have bolts there or things that need to be, screwed in to keep the paneling at place. But even when it comes to labeling, like it's in the corner. It's not here bang in the center. Of course it could be, but like it's more aesthetically pleasing to keep things close to your borders. And if you analyze a lot of sci-fi design, you'll see this, right? Even something as small as this, where you have, again, like a 1/3 cutout. And then we have detailing at the edges of this cutout. So again, these are like small things that make your designs look more appealing. Right. This is another one for Overwatch. Again, a very, very cool design. I'm just going to go over this one briefly. The cool thing about this one is that, and this is where experience comes into play. Again, with the, like, what I'm going to show you here is, it's just only edge manipulation, right? But they have a very cylindrical design, right? So I'm going to take the main design. And again, pay attention. It's like 2/3 of this design and then 1/3 of this design. And in terms of big, medium, small, we have a very, very obvious big shape, medium shape, and then a smaller shape. Right. So again, they pay very close attention to these things and to these divisions. But when it comes to making this cylindrical shape more interesting, instead of just making a cylinder like this, right? Instead of just cutting it out like that, what they do is they also round the edges, again, pure edge manipulation, right, to the middle. And then they also make a double, so a multiple rounding. Like this, right, with like a fancy cutout. But so as you can see, all that's going on here, instead of this being a straight, from here on, and like again, I'm gonna have to keep repeating this, but the rounding kind of begins at like, you know, 2/3 of the way down. They kind of round it out, and then they have a multiple rounding on top of that. Right? So everything's just really carefully thought out, but it's a very simplistic manipulation done in a very experienced manner. That's actually the gist of this classroom, of this brief classroom, that I want to, you know, tell you guys. It's not rocket science, whatever these cool designers are doing. It's just applying fundamentals in a careful manner, right? And thinking about it. And of course, it does require a ton of mileage and doing this again and again to kind of find your type of design and what you find the pleasing, you know, what you find pleasing to look at and things like that. But it's usually just simple manipulation done right. Also things like this, right? Super simple, like most of you can figure this out. But like making this the way it is very hard to do, right? So there's a couple of things going on here. Of course, there's like a rule of 3 in terms of it's a triangular shape, right? With circular elements, which is already an appealing look, but you know, pulling it off successfully is very hard to do. If we look at another type of proportion, like this circle or this cylinder, better, right? It takes up 1/3 of the entire encompassing shape, right? So if I were to draw a circle around this entire shape, I'm gonna just cheat it. Right. So like this, like that inner circle would take up like approximately 1/3 of the space, right? So again, pleasing ratio, very appealing, and of course we have, you know, obviously 3 extensions to this. And then again, when it comes to the shape manipulation itself or the edge manipulation, we have simple boxes. Like this. And then sort of at like 1/5 rule. So this is one where you see like a 1/5 example. So this is like a 1/5. They start cutting it down, basically subtracting a shape from the box, rounding out the corners, as you see in the singular rounding, right? And then a double rounding on the bottom. Right, so everything to make it a shape look appealing just comes down to the ratio in which you cut off or you subtract or you add to your simple shape, and then what kind of chamfering, beveling, or whatever you apply makes it easier to make appealing shapes. I'm not saying it is easy, but applying those principles makes it easier. And this is one by my buddy Jonas Minabo. Definitely go follow him as fast as you can on ArtStation. Right, I'm gonna highlight this. But so he's like the king of sci-fi design, in my opinion. But again, he has this beautiful balance of functional versus entertaining, right? And which is very, very hard to pull off. It also requires you to know a little bit more about the things that you're designing, right? Not just go for that graphic design appeal, but more for making a sci-fi element look functional and believable, right? Which is very hard to pull off, and it does require a little bit more knowledge. But again, the principles that he applies in terms of graphic design stay exactly the same, right? As you can see here, if we were to draw a box around what he has going on here, I find this a super appealing shape, right? This could easily be like something out of a spaceship as well. We have like a beautiful principle of these. So let me draw the box first. Of multiple rounded edges, right? So again, in like a 1/3, he subtracts a part of the box, right? That should be here. That gets cut out, right? So again, you're already creating a more interesting silhouette. And then he rounds off with a singular rounding first. Those corners, just going to draw through the shape. And then he also applies like multiple rounding from here to here. And then even on the exhaust element itself, he also applies it. I'm not going to trace over this completely, but as you can see, right, this is like multiple rounding and then singular rounding combined together. And again, in terms of shape relation, we have 2/3 and then 1/3. And on that 1/3 sits most of the detail, right? Again, making for a very, very pleasing design. So here are some more. I think I've gone over enough examples of what I mean. And I think what you guys should do, especially for like the part 2 assignments where I make you analyze other artists, copy other artists, is try to find the things that I'm talking about here in terms of graphic design breakup, where they bevel edges, how they do it. Try to find that in those designs. Could be any design, doesn't have to be the examples that I show you here. Again, if you give me any sci-fi design, usually a lot of these principles apply. Right, so this one, for instance, a very, very classic spaceship from Overwatch. It's just exactly that principle of creating something interesting, or first diluting a very, very simple shape into a more rounded shape on certain edges, and then creating like that multiple rounding that I talk about in the classrooms. So just things like that alone, and not like this cylinder that we have here. It's just a beveled cylinder, right? Like this. Again, beveling is what makes these things work. And it's the way that they combine them and the ratio in which they combine them, especially where they choose like to add detail and where to make areas of rest, is what makes this thing work. Of course, it has to resemble a plane, so you do have to have those primary shapes resemble a plane of whatever kind you want it to resemble. But then you can really play with the edge manipulation and the ratio of things to make things look more appealing. And then lastly, even in stupid things like the mechanical leg that I did on my last character, Remus, right? This is all just edge manipulation. These can be diluted down into very, very simple and basic shapes. And I know that when I'm talking about this, and I use the word simple a lot, is that it's not as simple as I make it out to be. It does take a lot of practice in order to achieve, this kind of complexity. But that's the core principle. It's instead of what I'm making you guys do, like round off the edges and then, do multiple rounding of the edges. It's just playing with the proportions in which you manipulate your edges. So instead of going straight down, you go down into like a softer curve, and you kind of vary up the way in which you round off your corners. But again, rounding off those corners is what makes those things look functional and more appealing. And then of course there's an added thing of like looking at reference of how things are manufactured, or what kind of detailing you can use in your manipulated shapes to make them look more functional. Like for instance, this is something I probably got from like a heavy machinery, right, where you can just see this sort of detailing. It was like, hey, cool, I can add this to my design to make it look more functional. But these are like small things that can help you.
Ik begrijp het niet.
Google started talking to me. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to show you is a really cool exercise that you can do, which I'm not making you do in this assignment, but again, it is really beneficial, is repurposing or making an existing object, like something very vintage, like you see here. This is also from Overwatch, by the way. It's something very vintage, like a very old school sort of camera, what they use for like cinematic cameras, right? But making that one look more sci-fi, right? And the way that they do it is just by using everything that I discussed when it comes to beveling edges, using proportionally accurate, or using the proportions of graphic design to make everything look more appealing, and also stating the obvious, right? Instead of, because on a real camera, this would be not as obvious, like where it pivots, or where everything is. Like on this one, it's like they really highlight, like, hey, this is what this thing does, right? It's a lot of, or not, this is what this thing uses to move or to pivot or whatever. So that's something that you can really try and emphasize in your designs as well. Go for like the very graphic design in terms of appeal and entertainment, but then state the obvious, like I said, where you put an emphasis on the functionality of your design to make it look believable and to make it work. And then lastly, I quickly did this before the session. So what you just saw with the camera is something that you can try and do yourself. Is you take something that's super vintage, you do like a block out. It doesn't have to exactly mimic what you're drawing, but it has to have the gist and the silhouette and the primary shapes of it. And then you're kind of using what you already see, right, in terms of block out, but you state the obvious in terms of where things pivot, or how things function. Like for instance, this is where you talk through. I'm going to highlight that in the detailing here, right? So this is something that you can then repurpose, like this is where you talk through or whatever. This is my pivot, or the functionality of how it moves. And then we use like the detailing that I discussed in terms of shape breakup, beveling, keeping your detailing on the edges, using like these asymmetrical cutouts to make things look more manufactured. By the way, if you see things like this, like cutouts of shapes, usually this makes things look more manufactured, because it actually what engineers try to do is use the minimum amount of weight that they can to make the structure as strong as it can be, right? So it's finding that balance of sturdiness versus weight, because the heavier things are, of course, the more weight they have, the more energy they consume if they're like in vehicles or whatever. A good example of this is like if you look at airplane seats, if you're ever in an airplane, look under the airplane seat. So where chairs have these the things that they're bolted onto the floor with, they're cut up with holes in every direction, right? Just because to make the weight of those chairs a lot less for the benefit of flying, right? So those are things that you can, subtleties that you can look for that make things more functional, or make them at least appear more functional. And so this is what you can do, like repurpose a vintage piece of technology and make it look more sci-fi. It doesn't have to be like sci-fi in this like Overwatch type of fashion. You can do it in the fashion of the sci-fi that you really admire. But again, like the principles that I talk about here are things that you can definitely find in any type of sci-fi. They might just be in a different proportion, or there might be emphasis on something else instead of, there might be emphasis on something when it comes to functionality, or more emphasis on functionality instead of more emphasis on graphic design. In other sci-fi, there will be a lot more emphasis on graphic design versus functionality. So you can play with those ratios, but usually all of those principles do apply to making things look more sci-fi. Yeah. And then coloring is an entirely different thing, but you can also just use graphic design. But I think that's all I wanted to say about this. Do you guys have any questions about that, or things I haven't covered? No questions? Everything clear? Again, this is I just wanted to discuss these principles for you to maybe better understand like where these designs come from and why they look appealing. I feel like a lot of the times this is very overlooked. And it's fairly simplistic. Once you know these principles, it's easy to apply them, or quote unquote easy, but you do have to know them, and there are a lot more, but I find like these 4 that I listed will help you a long way, right? So beveling, that's why I make you guys do these things, like edge manipulation, contour manipulation. All these things will help you make more interesting shapes. And then when it comes to sci-fi, good addition, good subtraction in like the graphic design sort of way, on the 1/3, 1/5 principle, that will help you a long way as well to keep things in check and keep them more interesting. And then also stating the obvious, right? Highlighting your functionalities. Think of a mech design, you highlight the joints. Whatever it is, you highlight the functionality of your object, which will make it easier for you to communicate whatever it is you're trying to communicate. I'm going to read a question. Is there something specific about the rule of thirds, fifths, or can it be any kind of ratio, like doing something 1/7? Well, you definitely could, Reptile Head, but like LeBlanc said, like usually the golden ratio is a good one. Exactly 1.6 or 1.618, I think it is. That's a little specific. but usually, like in the beginning, just stick to the thirds and the fifths. That's going to be hard enough to figure out anyway. And then when you go to like higher increments, like 1/7, it's hard to distinguish if it's hard to distinguish the shapes at which point you're breaking up, and that might make things look too noisy. The artist that I mentioned in the Gumroad, I'm just gonna artists mentioned Jonas Minabo. I think it's Peterson or Peterson with a double E. I'm not sure. But yeah. Kind of unrelated question. Do you think that the golden spiral does anything at all in composition? Because most of the time I try to look at... Yeah, the golden spiral is just something you can use, LGN, but it's not like a written rule. And it's also, if you want to use the golden spiral, you have to measure it out, right? You can divide your canvas on 1 versus 1.618 if you want to, but I mean, at that point you're doing it mathematically almost, which you can, but I prefer to eyeball it a little bit, keep a little bit of the intuitiveness, also in design like this, where I use like a 1/3 or a 1/5 ratio. I'm not sure. I'll try to link the Mike Hill talk later. Cool, but then I'm gonna stop recording, guys, if you don't have any questions anymore. Thank you for attending. I hope it was useful. I'll upload this later this week so you can review it and use it in your own designs and shapes. And I'll see you in the next one.